Today, we will be looking at 14 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. Each story starts with confidence, but ends in chaos. One wrong turn, one mistake, one moment underground, and everything turns into unimaginable terror. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On June 19th, 1988, two divers entered an underwater cave in Mexico to recover equipment from a previous fatal accident. What should have been a straightforward recovery mission turned into another tragedy. Chacalal Cave sits at the bottom of Chacalal Lagoon near Acumal, Mexico, part of the extensive underwater cave systems that run through the Yucatan Peninsula. By June 1988, the cave had already earned a deadly reputation. Just over a year earlier, on May 3, 1987, a double fatality had occurred in the system when two divers became lost and drowned in the flooded passages, leaving their scuba equipment behind in the cave. On this particular June day, two men arrived at Chacalal Lagoon with a plan to recover the gear that had been abandoned in the cave during the previous year's fatal accident. The equipment was expensive, and someone had decided it was worth attempting a recovery dive despite the cave's obvious dangers. But here's where the story takes its first terrible turn. These two divers had absolutely no business entering an underwater cave. They had no cavern training and no cave diving certification. They were open water divers attempting one of the most dangerous types of diving that exists, in a cave that had already killed two people just over a year earlier. But probably greed took them over. Their equipment setup was equally problematic. Each diver had only a single light. No backup illumination if that one light failed in the pitch-black flooded passages. They were using twin tanks yoked together with only a single outlet, which meant if that one valve or regulator failed, they would have no way to access the air in their tanks. And apparently, they hadn't bothered to properly plan their air consumption using the standard rule of thirds that cave divers rely on for safety. But perhaps the most bizarre and dangerous aspect of their dive was the guideline system they had rigged. Experienced cave divers use guidelines as their lifeline back to the entrance, a continuous line from open water into the cave that they can follow even in zero visibility conditions. The guideline is typically laid by the lead diver, who carries a spool and unreels line as the team penetrates deeper into the system. The system these two divers created was, in the words of the later investigation, bizarre and unorthodox. They secured one end of the line at the entrance, then had the lead diver drape the line over his shoulder as he swam into the cave. The second diver followed behind, holding the spool that the line was being pulled from. This meant the lead diver was essentially acting as a human pulley, with the guideline running from the entrance over his shoulder and back to the spool held by the diver behind him. This setup violated every principle of cave diving safety. If the lead diver needed to turn around, the line system would become a tangled mess. The two divers entered the water and began their penetration into Chacalal Cave. They descended into the flooded passages. The lead diver had the line draped over his shoulder, and his partner followed behind with the spool, feeding out line as they progressed. They made it approximately 200 feet, 60 meters into the cave system when everything went catastrophically wrong. The second diver, the one holding the spool, suddenly panicked. Whether he saw something that frightened him, experienced equipment problems, or simply became overwhelmed by the dark, enclosed environment isn't clear, but his panic triggered a chain reaction. In his panicked state, the second diver did what panicked divers often do. He bolted for the exit. He dropped the spool, or released the line, and began swimming frantically back toward the entrance, probably stirring up massive amounts of silt from the cave floor with his frantic fin kicks. When the second diver released his end of the line, or dropped the spool, the entire bizarre guideline system failed instantly. The lead diver, who had the line draped over his shoulder, suddenly lost contact with it. He found himself suddenly alone in the cave, with no guideline to follow back to the entrance. The silt cloud created by the second diver's panicked exit had reduced visibility in the passage to absolute zero. The lead diver was now in a complete whiteout, unable to see his hand in front of his face, even with his light on. Without a guideline to follow and with zero visibility, he was effectively lost in an underwater maze. The second diver somehow managed to navigate back to the entrance in his panicked state and emerge from the cave. He immediately knew his partner was in serious trouble, trapped somewhere in the flooded passages with compromised visibility and no guideline. He quickly notified an instructor at the nearby Kapolum dive shop, who understood the gravity of the situation and immediately called Jim Koch, an American diver who was in the area and had cave diving experience. Koch and the instructor rushed to cave, hoping they could mount a rescue before the trapped diver ran out of air. They calculated that if the diver was conserving his air and staying calm, he might still be alive. They entered the water at 6 p.m., carrying proper cave diving equipment and laying a proper guideline as they penetrated into the system, but they were already too late. About 200 feet into the cave, roughly where the second diver had panicked, they found the body of the lost diver. His air had run out, and he had died alone in the darkness of the flooded passage. The scene that greeted the rescue divers was heartbreaking and horrifying. The dead diver's fingers appeared to have clawed at the rock walls surrounding him. In his final moments, as his air supply ran out and he began drowning, he had frantically scratched at the limestone, probably in a desperate, irrational attempt to dig his way out or find some pocket of air. The rock bore the marks of his final, futile struggle. The psychological terror of those final minutes must have been unimaginable. The lead diver would have been swimming through zero visibility, trying desperately to find the exit or relocate the lost guideline. As his air supply dropped lower and lower, he would have known his time was running out. When his air finally ran out completely, he would have experienced the desperate, instinctive attempt to breathe underwater that accomplishes nothing except filling the lungs with water. In his final moments of consciousness before drowning, with no air left and his lungs burning for oxygen, he had clawed at the rock walls in pure animal panic. It was the last desperate act of someone who knew they were dying and was trying anything, no matter how impossible, to survive. Jim Koch and his team recovered the body from the flooded passage, along with the diver's equipment. While they were conducting the recovery operation, they also retrieved the scuba gear that had been left behind from the double fatality of May 3rd, 1987. The very equipment these two untrained divers had entered the cave to recover in the first place. The recovery teams also removed all the previously installed lines from the cave to prevent future accidents. Following this third fatality in just over a year, authorities made the decision to close Shakalal Cave and the surrounding lagoon to all diving operations. The cave had proven too dangerous, and too many people had died in its flooded passages. On December 15, 1988, 3 cave divers descended into Emerald Sink in Florida for what should have been a routine dive within their certification limits. But when their leader made a fatally wrong decision at a critical junction deep in the cave, 2 divers would face an agonizing choice: follow their experienced leader deeper into the flooded maze, or trust their own instincts and abandon him to save themselves. Emerald Sink sits in Wakulla County, Florida, part of the extensive network of underwater cave systems that make the region a world-renowned destination for cave diving. The sink is the entrance to a complex system of flooded passages that connect to other sinks and springs throughout the area, creating an underwater maze that extends for thousands of feet in multiple directions. On this particular December day, 3 divers gathered at Emerald Sink, all holding basic cave certified credentials. The entry-level certification for cave diving that comes with strict limits on depth, penetration distance, and diving parameters. The group was led by Bill Cronin, who reportedly had somewhere between 100 and 125 cave dives under his belt. His 2 companions were less experienced, but trusted Cronin's leadership based on his dive count. Cronin was using an advanced equipment configuration called side-mounted twin 80s. 2 independent scuba tanks mounted low on his hips in what's known as the British side mount fashion. This is a complex setup that requires constantly switching between regulators and monitoring 2 separate tank pressures. His two companions were using more standard dual manifolded double 80s, where both tanks are connected and share the same regulator system. The three divers descended into Emerald Sink and began their penetration into the cave system. They were following a guideline that had been previously installed by other divers, which would theoretically lead them safely into the cave and back out again. The dive plan was to penetrate for about 800 feet, 244 meters, to a depth of 150 feet, 45 meters, or for 20 minutes, whichever came first. But here's the problem. Everything about this dive plan violated the parameters of our basic cave certification. Basic cave divers are supposed to stay within 100 feet of depth, 30 meters, use only 1/3 of a single tank or 1/6 of doubles for penetration, and avoid decompression dives entirely. This group was planning to go 50 feet, 15 meters deeper than their certification allowed, use 1/3 of their doubles instead of 1/6, and conduct a dive that would definitely require decompression stops on the way back out. But Cronin apparently had a habit of pushing beyond his certification limits and encouraging others to do the same. He had been repeatedly warned by instructors, including his own basic cave instructor, to complete his full training before attempting advanced dives. But he had ignored those warnings and continued diving beyond his certification parameters. The three divers made their way through the flooded passages, following the existing guideline deeper into the system. They passed one line junction where multiple guide ropes met, marking a decision point where different passages branched off in different directions. They continued past this junction, going deeper into the cave toward their planned turnaround point. At 150 feet, 45 meters deep, and roughly 800 feet, 244 meters into the cave, Cronin signaled to his companions that they had reached their limit and it was time to turn around. The three divers reversed direction and began their exit from the cave system, following the same guideline back toward the entrance. When they reached the line junction they had passed on the way in, they made a critical decision. They chose to follow a line that was marked with exit arrows, standard cave diving markers that point toward the nearest exit. This should have been the correct choice. Exit arrows are specifically placed to guide divers out of cave systems safely. But as they continued following this line toward what they believed was the entrance, Cronin suddenly signaled to his two companions by flashing his light to get their attention. He indicated that they were going the wrong way, that the line they were following was not leading them back to Emerald Sink. His companions were confused and concerned. They were following exit arrows on the guideline, which should have been leading them towards safety. But Cronin was their leader, the one with over 100 cave dives, and they trusted his experience over their own judgment. Despite their misgivings, they turned around and followed Cronin back into the cave toward the line junction. When they reached the junction again, Cronin pointed into a different passage, a deep tunnel that actually led to clear-cut sink, some 5,000 feet, 1,524 meters, away in a completely different direction. He indicated that this was the correct route back to their entry point at Emerald Sink. But Cronin's companions were now genuinely frightened. They checked their air gauges and realized their air supplies were running dangerously low. They had already been underwater for a significant amount of time, had reached depths of 150 feet, 45 meters, and didn't have the air reserves necessary to make another wrong turn. They were certain the line marked with exit arrows was correct, and that Cronin was making a fatal error in judgment. They tried to communicate this to Cronin, tried to convince him that he was wrong about the route. But either Cronin couldn't understand what they were trying to tell him, or he was so convinced of his own judgment that he refused to listen to his companions' concerns. The communication breakdown in the flooded passage, combined with Cronin's apparent certainty that he was correct, created an impossible situation. The two companions were now faced with a terrible choice. They could follow their leader deeper into the cave system toward clear-cut sink, burning through what little air they had left on what they believed was the wrong route. Or they could trust their own instincts, follow the line marked with exit arrows, and abandon their leader to whatever fate awaited him in the flooded passages. It was a decision that haunted them, but survival instinct won out over loyalty. The two divers made the agonizing choice to split from Cronin and follow the line with the exit arrows. They turned away from their leader and swam toward what they believed was safety, leaving Cronin alone in the cave as he headed deeper into the tunnel toward Clear-Cut Sink. The two companions made it back to the entrance at Emerald Sink, but they were in critical condition. Their air supplies were nearly exhausted, and they hadn't had enough air left to complete the required decompression stops on their ascent. They had been forced to make an emergency ascent, risking decompression sickness, the bends, to avoid drowning from lack of air. Fortunately, they had left oxygen bottles at the surface as a contingency, and they immediately began breathing supplemental oxygen to help off-gas the excess nitrogen in their bloodstream from the deep dive. Despite skipping their decompression stops, they reported no symptoms of decompression sickness, though they had come dangerously close to a very different outcome. But Bill Cronin wasn't with them. He was still somewhere in the flooded cave system, alone and following what he believed was the correct route back to Emerald Sink. A recovery team was immediately assembled and sent into the cave to search for Cronin. These were experienced cave diving rescue specialists who knew the Emerald Sink system intimately. They followed the passages systematically, checking every branch and tunnel for any sign of the missing diver. The recovery divers found Cronin's body approximately 300 feet, 91 meters, from the entrance to Emerald Sink, at a depth of 117 feet, 35 meters. But here's what was particularly tragic about his location. He was in a pocket in the ceiling of the cave, while the guideline at that point was down at 145 feet depth, 44 meters. Cronin had become separated from the guideline and had apparently been trying to find it by searching along the ceiling of the passage. Cronin's depth gauge read 160 feet, 48.7 meters, indicating he had unknowingly descended another 10 feet, 3 meters, after separating from his team. Investigators concluded he then swam approximately 200 feet, 61 meters, deeper into the cave, heading toward Clear-Cut Sink, a completely incorrect direction. When recovery divers checked his equipment, his tanks showed only 150 pounds per square inch in one and 350 pounds per square inch in the other. Critically low, barely enough for a few breaths at that depth. He had essentially run out of air while lost inside the flooded passage. A more alarming discovery followed. Both of his regulators were found significantly out of adjustment. The ambient bleeds were clogged, meaning they would have breathed poorly at depth, forcing him to exert extra effort just to inhale air. This would have accelerated nitrogen narcosis, a state of cognitive impairment caused by breathing nitrogen under pressure. At 150 to 160 feet, 45 to 49 meters, narcosis is already expected, but struggling to breathe intensifies it rapidly. This explains his irrational decision at the line junction. His companions were correctly following exit arrows, the most reliable indicator of the way out in cave diving. But Cronin, heavily impaired by narcosis, insisted they were going the wrong way. He then swam off alone, heading nearly 5,000 feet, 1,524 meters, in the wrong direction. His backup lights were also found with low batteries, confirming poor overall equipment maintenance. Only his primary light was functioning. The incident was the result of multiple preventable factors: diving beyond certification limits, poorly maintained equipment, regulator malfunction, narcosis, and overconfidence. Cronin's experience had given him confidence, but not discipline. His two companions were forced to make a critical decision: follow him into probable death or trust their own judgment and leave. They chose survival. Cronin's body was later found in a ceiling pocket, separated from the guideline and completely out of air, likely searching blindly for an escape route in his final moments. July 1981. The International Congress had concluded with its usual mix of technical presentations, equipment demonstrations, and passionate discussions about cave diving. For Bob Nadich and Scott Morris, two experienced cave divers, the event served as both education and inspiration. But while other attendees were packing their bags and heading home, Nadich and Morris had different plans. They were headed to Craddock Springs in Kentucky, where an unfinished piece of exploration awaited them. Cave diving operates on a principle of constant forward progress. Divers don't simply revisit the same underwater passages repeatedly. They push leads, explore virgin territory, and extend the known boundaries of subterranean water systems. Nadich and Morris had discovered a promising lead during a previous expedition to Craddock Springs, a passage that hinted at continuation deeper into the limestone labyrinth. The prospect of discovering new cave had drawn them back. The dive site at Craddock Springs presented the typical challenges of Kentucky cave diving. The water was cold, visibility varied depending on recent weather and silt conditions, and the passages were characterized by breakdown, the jumbled collapse of rock that creates both obstacles and potential routes through the cave system. Unlike the pristine, open tunnels found in some cave systems, diving through breakdown requires careful navigation, precise buoyancy control, and constant awareness of the unstable nature of the surrounding rock. Both divers were well prepared for the challenges ahead. Their experience level placed them in the upper echelon of cave diving expertise. They understood the risks inherent in pushing exploration leads, particularly in areas where breakdown created unpredictable conditions. Cave diving fatalities often involved inexperienced divers who ventured beyond their training, but organized cave divers with proper certification and experience maintained remarkably good safety records. The dive began without incident. Following the familiar route through Craddock Springs, they navigated the initial passages with practiced efficiency. Their twin beams of light cut through the water, illuminating the underwater landscape of rock, silt, and the occasional flash of blind cavefish adapted to eternal darkness. Eventually, they reached the area where their previous exploration had ended. The lead they hoped would open into new territory. What they discovered was disappointing. The passage they had found before appeared to have closed, victim to the slow but inexorable shifting of breakdown. In cave systems, particularly those characterized by unstable rock formations, passages can change over time. What was open during one expedition might be blocked during the next, sealed by rocks that have settled or shifted under their own weight. Despite this setback, they decided to proceed with running a survey line through the area. Proper cave surveying requires meticulous placement of guidelines that future divers can follow, ensuring safe navigation and preventing disorientation in the underwater maze. This work, while less glamorous than discovering virgin passage, formed the essential infrastructure of cave exploration. Morris was working on setting the line when disaster struck without warning. A slab of breakdown, destabilized by their presence or simply surrendering to gravity after an equilibrium measured in decades, suddenly detached from its position. The rock fell directly onto Morris's legs, pinning him against the cave floor. The situation transformed instantly from routine survey work to a life-threatening nightmare. Morris was trapped beneath water, unable to move, with his air supply ticking down with each breath. In the confined space of the cave passage, surrounded by unstable breakdown, any attempted escape risked triggering additional rock falls that could worsen his predicament or trap both divers. Nadich, positioned above Morris in the water column, immediately recognized something was catastrophically wrong. His first indication came not from seeing the accident directly, but from observing Morris's exhaust bubbles. In normal diving, exhaled air rises in sporadic bursts corresponding to breathing patterns. What Nadich observed was different, a continuous stream of bubbles rising from a single location, suggesting that Morris's regulator had been knocked free, or that he was breathing rapidly in distress. The nature of underwater communication meant that shouted warnings or verbal exchanges were impossible. Hand signals worked only when both divers could see each other, and the disturbed silt from the rockfall had likely reduced visibility to near zero. Nadich had to make immediate decisions based on limited information, knowing that Morris's life depended on rapid, correct action. Descending through the clouded water, Nadich located Morris pinned beneath the breakdown slab. The weight of waterlogged limestone, potentially hundreds of pounds, pressed against Morris's legs. The trapped diver's face would have shown the strain of the situation, visible even through his dive mask. Every second counted. At depth, Breathing air at increased pressure, their gas supplies depleted faster than on the surface. Add the stress of the emergency, which naturally increased breathing rates, and their window of opportunity to solve this problem was measured in minutes, not hours. Nadich positioned himself to assist Morris in shifting the rock. In the weightless environment of underwater cave diving, leverage works differently than on land. Divers can brace against the ceiling, floor, or walls to generate force, but the lack of gravity means that pushing often results in the diver moving rather than the object. Additionally, too much force or an awkward shift could trigger additional breakdown, potentially burying both divers under tons of stone. Working together despite the extreme stress and limited visibility, the two divers managed to shift the slab enough for Morris to extract his legs. The rock, grudgingly yielding to their combined effort, moved just enough to create the gap Morris needed. He pulled himself free, likely fighting through pain if his legs had been injured by the initial impact or the weight pressing on them. The moment of liberation brought enormous relief, but the emergency was far from over. They still needed to exit the cave safely, navigating back through the breakdown-choked passages while managing whatever injuries Morris had sustained and dealing with the adrenaline and stress of the near catastrophe. With Morris freed from the rock's grip, the two divers began their careful ascent back through the cave system. The pair maintained close contact throughout the exit, Nadich monitoring Morris for any signs of shock or deteriorating condition that could complicate their escape. Upon finally surfacing at the spring entrance, they conducted a preliminary assessment of Morris's injuries. While painful and requiring medical attention, the damage appeared manageable: bruising, possible contusions, but nothing that suggested fractures or crush injuries. The Craddock Spring incident proved how survival in cave diving depends on teamwork, awareness, and calm execution. Morris lived only because he had a buddy. Without Nadich, he would have died pinned underwater. Nadich's sharp awareness let him detect trouble just from unusual bubble patterns, despite not seeing the accident happen. And because both divers were highly trained, they stayed calm instead of panicking, avoiding the rapid air loss and bad decisions that often turn accidents fatal. Friday, August 1st, 1980, began as another summer day in Chattooga County, Georgia. For Ron Langston, a 33-year-old certified scuba instructor, it represented an opportunity to explore one of the region's hidden underwater caves. The submerged cave system at the headwaters of Armuchee Creek had drawn him and his diving companions to its dark entrance, promising the thrill of discovery that drove cave explorers to venture into places few humans had ever seen. Langston carried credentials that should have signaled competence and safety awareness. He was certified with both the National Association of Underwater Instructors and the YMCA, organizations that emphasize proper training and adherence to safety protocols. As an instructor, he had presumably taught others about the dangers of diving and the importance of following established procedures. Yet, on this August afternoon, Langston would make a series of decisions that violated every principle of safe cave diving, decisions that would cost him his life. The cave entrance at Armuchee Creek presented the typical challenges of submerged cave systems in the southeastern United States. The water, fed by underground springs, maintained a constant cool temperature regardless of the summer heat above. Visibility varied depending on recent rainfall and sediment disturbance. The passages alternated between spacious chambers and constricted squeezes that tested both a diver's physical size and psychological comfort with confined spaces. Langston and his companions entered the water equipped with standard scuba gear, their tanks filled with compressed air. The initial penetration into the system proceeded normally as they followed whatever natural guideline the cave provided. At some point during their exploration, the group encountered a restriction, a tight place in the cave that would require careful navigation to pass through. These constrictions are common features in cave diving, places where the passage narrows dramatically, sometimes to openings barely large enough for a human body to squeeze through. Beyond this particular restriction, the cave apparently continued, tempting the explorers with the possibility of virgin passage and new discoveries. Instead of navigating the restriction with his full equipment, Langston made the inexplicable decision to remove his normal diving gear. He exchanged his primary tank, which would have contained sufficient air for the dive with appropriate reserves for emergencies, for a pony bottle, a small auxiliary tank, typically used only as an emergency backup. A pony bottle contains a fraction of the air supply in a standard scuba tank. The one Langston chose held approximately 10 minutes of breathing gas under normal conditions. 10 minutes. Not 10 minutes to explore and 10 minutes to return. 10 minutes total. In cave diving, where the rule of thirds dictates that divers should use 1/3 of their air going in, 1/3 coming out, and reserve 1/3 for emergencies, Langston's decision left him with perhaps 3 minutes of useful exploration time before he needed to turn back. The reason for this decision seemed to be the restriction itself. By removing his bulkier standard equipment and switching to the minimal profile of a pony bottle, Langston could more easily squeeze through the tight opening. What lay beyond apparently held such appeal that he was willing to sacrifice the safety margin provided by adequate air supply. He was way too excited for this exploration, perhaps. His restlessness said it all. Before his diving partners could properly prepare to follow, before they could attach a safety line to him that would allow them to track his location and potentially retrieve him in an emergency, Langston pushed through the restriction and continued into the cave beyond. He disappeared into the darkness alone, connected to his companions by nothing more than the weak beams of underwater lights that would quickly fade as distance and cave geometry intervened. His partners waited at the restriction, likely expecting Langston to return within minutes given his severely limited air supply. Minutes passed. The 10-minute mark came and went. Still no sign of Langston. The situation shifted from concerning to critical to desperate. As they realized their companion was not coming back, Langston convinced himself that 10 minutes was sufficient time for a quick look beyond the restriction. He had underestimated the distance or complexity of the passage beyond. He experienced target fixation, so focused on reaching his goal that he failed to properly consider the risks. Whatever his reasoning, now he was in trouble. The decision to leave a missing diver and surface is never made lightly. But Langston's partners faced an impossible situation. They could not fit through the restriction with their gear to search for him. Their own air supplies were depleting. Remaining underwater beyond their safety limits would only create additional victims. Eventually, with their own gas reserves dwindling, they were forced to make the agonizing decision to depart and notify authorities. They surfaced and immediately contacted emergency services. A Floyd County rescue unit arrived at the cave entrance at 7:30 p.m., approximately 6.5 hours after the group had initially entered the water. The rescue team conducted an initial search, but quickly recognized the limitations of their training and equipment. This was not a typical water rescue. It was a technical cave diving recovery that required specialized skills and equipment. The rescuers contacted experienced cave divers from Atlanta, summoning experts who regularly trained for exactly these scenarios. Cave diving recovery operations present unique challenges. The victim's location is unknown, visibility may be severely compromised, the cave environment is inherently dangerous, and the recovery divers must risk their own lives to retrieve someone who is almost certainly already deceased. The rescue team went inside and methodically kept searching for any signs. They made their way through the restriction, and when they finally located Langston's body, they found it wedged in a rock crack near the cave entrance. The discovery raised questions about what had happened in Langston's final minutes. Larry Blair, involved in the recovery efforts, speculated that Langston might have panicked when his air supply ran out and attempted to force himself through what he believed was the entrance to the cave. The body was wedged so tightly in the crack that recovery proved extremely difficult. The divers ultimately had to use a shovel to pry the corpse free from the rocks that gripped it. A grim task that underscored the violence of Langston's final struggle. He had apparently wedged himself into the restriction with such force, driven by panic and the desperate need for air, that his body became irrevocably stuck. The analysis of Langston's death revealed a cascade of failures in judgment, each compounding the danger of the previous decision. The absence of a safety line meant his partners had no way to track his location or retrieve him when he failed to return. The lack of a rigid time limit, or Langston's decision to ignore such a limit if it existed, meant he ventured beyond the point where his minimal air supply could support a return trip. Most critically, his decision to proceed alone, separated from his diving partners by a restriction they could not pass, violated the fundamental buddy system that serves as the foundation of diving safety. The tragedy revealed a troubling pattern in underwater cave fatalities. Langston possessed certifications from respected diving organizations. He had training. He understood, at least intellectually, the dangers of cave diving. Yet he created his own set of fatal circumstances through a series of conscious choices that violated basic safety principles. The phenomenon appeared repeatedly in cave diving accident reports. Experienced divers, people who should have known better, made spur-of-the-moment decisions driven by enthusiasm, curiosity, or overconfidence. Why would a certified instructor with 2 separate training organizations' credentials make such obviously dangerous choices? No one will know why. On February 24, 2001, 2 experienced cave explorers prepared to descend into Rattling Cave in Tennessee. Rattling Cave features a dramatic entrance, a vertical drop of 133 feet, 40.5 meters, straight down into the earth. On this particular February day, Rame Pritchett, who was 34 years old, and her companion Michael Green arrived at Rattling Cave to explore the passages that lay beyond the entrance pit. Both were experienced spelunkers who understood vertical rope techniques and had the equipment necessary for the descent. They began the process of rigging the entrance drop, which involves securing ropes to anchor points at the top of the pit and making sure everything is set up properly for a safe descent. Once the rigging was complete, Green volunteered to descend first. He attached his rappel device to his harness, clipped onto the rope, and began his descent down the 133-foot pit. The rappel would have taken several minutes, slowly feeding rope through his device as he descended into the darkness below. Green reached the bottom of the pit safely and unclipped from the rope. He waited at the bottom, probably looking up at the small circle of daylight far above, ready to watch Pritchett make her descent. At the top of the pit, Pritchett prepared for her rappel. She was using a rappel rack, a common descending device used by cave explorers that allows for smooth, controlled descents on rope. The rack was attached to her seat harness using a single auto-locking carabiner, a metal clip with a gate that's supposed to lock automatically when closed, preventing it from opening accidentally. Auto-locking carabiners have a plastic locking sleeve that's designed to prevent the gate from opening once it's closed. In theory, this provides an extra layer of security compared to standard carabiners that require manual locking. But in practice, especially in the muddy, gritty environment of caves, these locking mechanisms can malfunction or fail. Pritchett clipped her rappel rack to her harness with this single auto-locking carabiner, checked her setup, and began her descent over the edge of the pit. She started feeding rope through her rack, beginning the long rappel down to where Green was waiting at the bottom. But something was wrong with Pritchett's setup, something that neither she nor Green had noticed during their equipment checks. The carabiner and rappel rack may have been oriented in a way that placed the eye of the rack across the carabiner gate rather than the spine. This is a dangerous configuration because as the loaded rack bears the climber's full weight, it can act as a lever against the carabiner gate. As Pritchett descended, possibly when she went over a lip or ledge during her rappel, the forces on her equipment shifted. The weight on the rappel rack created leverage against the carabiner gate, putting stress on the plastic locking sleeve that was supposed to keep the gate closed. Then, without warning, catastrophe struck. The plastic locking sleeve on Pritchett's carabiner broke. With the locking mechanism destroyed, the gate of the carabiner sprang open under the pressure from the loaded rappel rack. And in an instant, Pritchett's rappel device became completely detached from her harness. Pritchett suddenly found herself in free fall. One moment she had been rappelling normally, in complete control of her descent. The next moment, the rope and rappel device were gone, and she was plummeting through the air down the vertical pit. The fall happened so fast that Pritchett probably didn't have time to process what was happening before she hit the bottom. She fell the full remaining distance of the drop, potentially 100 feet or more, depending on how far she had descended before the equipment failure. Green, who was waiting at the bottom of the pit, heard or saw Pritchett falling toward him. There was nothing he could do, no time to move, no way to catch her or break her fall. Pritchett's body slammed into Green, face first, with tremendous force, and both of them crashed to the rocky floor of the pit. The impact was devastating for both of them. Pritchett had sustained the full trauma of a high-velocity fall from potentially 100 feet or more, with her body absorbing the impact of hitting both Green and the cave floor. She had suffered multiple fractures, broken bones throughout her body from the force of the landing. She also had head trauma, which is especially concerning in fall injuries because it can indicate skull fractures or brain injury. Green, who had been struck by Pritchett's falling body and then hit the ground himself, sustained injuries to his arm. While his injuries were less severe than Pritchett's, he was still hurt and in pain from the impact. For a few moments, both lay at the bottom of the 133-foot pit, injured and trying to comprehend what had just happened. The fall had occurred so suddenly and unexpectedly that the shock of it was almost as overwhelming as the physical trauma. Green, despite his arm injury, was in better condition than Pritchett. He could move and think clearly enough to assess the situation. Pritchett was seriously injured with multiple fractures and head trauma. She needed immediate medical attention, and they were at the bottom of a 133-foot vertical pit. Green understood that their only hope was for him to climb out of the pit and summon help. Pritchett couldn't climb. Her injuries were too severe. And even if Green stayed with her, there was nothing he could do to treat her broken bones and head trauma at the bottom of the pit. So Green prepared to make the ascent back up the rope, using his mechanical ascenders, devices that grip the rope and allow a climber to inch their way up vertical pitches. This would be a challenging climb under normal circumstances, but doing it with an injured arm while knowing his seriously hurt companion was lying at the bottom, waiting for help, would make it even more difficult. Green began his ascent, pulling himself up the rope foot by foot, using his ascenders and dealing with the pain from his injured arm. The 133-foot climb would have taken significant time and effort, and every moment he spent climbing was another moment that Pritchett lay injured at the bottom of the pit. When Green finally reached the top of the pit and emerged from the cave entrance, he immediately went for help. He contacted emergency services and explained the situation. The call went out to specialized cave rescue teams who understood vertical rope rescue and had the equipment and expertise needed for this kind of operation. The rescue teams arrived at Rattling Cave and began the complex process of organizing the extraction. They would need to descend into the pit with a rescue litter, a specialized stretcher designed for vertical rescue. They would need to carefully package Pritchett to immobilize her broken bones and protect her head injury. And then they would need to haul her up 133 feet of vertical rope while making sure the litter didn't bang against the rock walls or get snagged on any obstacles. Rescuers descended into the pit and found Pritchett still conscious but in extreme pain from her multiple injuries. They carefully examined her, stabilized her fractures as best they could in the field, and placed her in the rescue litter with padding and straps to immobilize her body for the vertical haul. Then came the difficult work of hauling Pritchett up the 133-foot pit. The rescue team used mechanical advantage systems with pulleys and ropes to slowly lift the litter, with team members stationed at various points to guide it and prevent it from hitting the rock walls. This kind of vertical rescue is exhausting, technical work that requires careful coordination and constant attention to safety. After what must have felt like an eternity to Pritchett, she finally emerged from the pit and was brought to the surface. Emergency medical personnel immediately took over her care, and she was transported to the hospital for treatment of her multiple fractures and head trauma. Pritchett's recovery would be lengthy and painful. Multiple fractures require significant healing time, and head trauma can have lasting effects that take months or even years to fully resolve. But, remarkably, Pritchett survived a fall that easily could have killed her. Falling 100 feet or more in a cave and surviving with injuries that eventually heal is an outcome that many people don't get. The investigation into what caused Pritchett's fall revealed the critical equipment failure. She had been using a single auto-locking carabiner with a plastic locking sleeve to attach her rappel rack to her seat harness. The plastic sleeve had broken, allowing the gate to open and the rack to become detached from her harness mid-rappel. Experts examining the incident noted that the carabiner and rappel rack may have been oriented in a way that placed the eye of the rack across the carabiner gate. In this position, when Pritchett's full weight was on the rack and she possibly went over a lip or ledge during her descent, the loaded rack acted as a lever against the carabiner gate, breaking either the gate itself or the plastic locking sleeve. This type of carabiner failure had been documented in other climbing and caving accidents as well. In the end, Pritchett lived to see another day, which she's always grateful for. In September 1985, 5 young people decided to spend the night camping in a shelter cave near the Platte River, south of Omaha, Nebraska. Their plans, however, didn't go as planned. Shelter caves are exactly what they sound like: natural reek overhangs or shallow caves that provide protection from the elements without requiring you to venture deep underground. They have been used by humans for thousands of years as temporary camping spots, offering a roof overhead and protection from wind and rain while still being open to the outside air. The shelter cave near the Platte River, south of Omaha, was one of these formations, a rock overhang in the bluffs along the river. These kinds of formations are common in river valleys where water and weather have carved out overhangs in the rock faces over centuries. In September 1985, a group of 5 young people decided this shelter cave would be the perfect spot for a camping trip. The group included Michael Wiles, who was just 12 years old, his older brother Mark Wiles, who was 18, and their friend David Funkhauser, who was 17. 2 other youths whose names weren't recorded in the accounts were also part of the camping group. For young people in Nebraska in the 1980s, camping in a shelter cave probably seemed like an ideal outdoor adventure. You got the experience of sleeping in nature with the added excitement of camping under a rock overhang, and you didn't need any special equipment or training like you would for deep cave exploration. It was accessible adventure that felt more interesting than just camping in a tent. The group arrived at the shelter cave in the late afternoon with their camping gear and supplies. As evening approached and the temperature began to drop, September nights in Nebraska can get quite cool, the group decided to build a campfire. They gathered firewood from the area and built their fire near the mouth of the shelter cave, where smoke could escape while still providing warmth to the space where they were sleeping. The campfire burned as the group sat around it, probably telling stories, eating their camping food, and enjoying the experience of spending a night in a shelter cave. Eventually, as the night grew late, the 5 young people settled into their sleeping bags beneath the rock overhang. The campfire was still burning, or had burned down to coals, providing residual heat to the shelter cave. They felt safe and comfortable. They were under a solid rock ceiling that had presumably been stable for centuries, and they were together as a group in a popular camping spot. But what the group didn't understand, what they had no way of knowing, was that they had created a deadly combination of circumstances that was slowly destabilizing the rock ceiling above them. 2 forces were at work: groundwater seepage and heat from the campfire, and together they were compromising the structural integrity of the overhang. Groundwater had been seeping through the rock layers above the shelter cave, probably for a long time. This constant moisture infiltration was gradually weakening the rock, working into cracks and joints in the stone, expanding and contracting with temperature changes, slowly turning solid rock into something more fragile. In geological terms, this process is called weathering, and it's how rock formations eventually break down and collapse. The heat from the campfire added another destabilizing factor. When rock is heated, it expands. When it cools, it contracts. This constant expansion and contraction creates stress within the rock structure, particularly along existing cracks and weak points. A campfire burning beneath a rock ceiling creates a significant temperature differential between the heated rock surface and the cooler rock behind it, amplifying these stresses. The combination of weakened rock from groundwater seepage and thermal stress from the fire was creating a situation where a large section of the cave ceiling was becoming increasingly unstable. But there was no visible warning, no creaking sounds, no falling pebbles to alert the sleeping campers that anything was wrong. The rock above them looked solid and permanent, as it had for generations of people who had sheltered beneath it. Then, without any warning whatsoever, catastrophe struck. A massive slab of the cave ceiling suddenly gave way and collapsed. One moment, 5 young people were sleeping peacefully beneath what appeared to be a solid rock overhang. The next moment, tons of rock and debris came crashing down on top of them. The collapse happened with devastating speed and force. The rock slab, weighing several tons, fell directly onto the sleeping area where the 5 young people were positioned. The impact was tremendous, and there was no time for anyone to react or try to escape. 3 of the 5 campers were directly beneath the falling rock slab when it collapsed. Michael Wiles, the 12-year-old boy, was crushed instantly beneath the falling debris. His 18-year-old brother, Mark, who was responsible for organizing the camping trip and looking after his younger brother, was killed in the same instant. Their friend David Funkhauser, the 17-year-old, also died beneath the falling rock. The 2 other youths in the group somehow escaped being crushed by the collapsing ceiling. Whether they were sleeping in a different area of the shelter that wasn't directly beneath the failing section, or whether they were just incredibly lucky in how the rock fell, they survived the collapse. But they were now trapped in a nightmare scenario. 3 of their friends had just been crushed to death by falling rock right next to them, and they were surrounded by tons of fallen debris in a partially collapsed shelter cave. The 2 survivors were in complete shock, unable to fully process what had just happened. They tried desperately to dig through the rubble to reach Michael, Mark, and David, hoping against hope that their friends might somehow have survived beneath the fallen rock. But the weight of the collapsed slab was enormous, far too heavy for 2 teenagers to move without equipment and help. The 2 survivors eventually had to make their way out of the partially collapsed shelter cave and seek help. When rescue workers and emergency personnel arrived at the shelter cave, they found a devastating scene. The rock overhang that had seemed like a perfect camping spot had partially collapsed, with a massive slab of ceiling now lying where the sleeping area had been. The bodies of Michael Wiles, Mark Wiles, and David Funkhauser were crushed beneath the rock, and recovery of their remains would require careful work with heavy equipment to lift the collapsed slab. The investigation into what caused the collapse identified the deadly combination of factors. Groundwater seepage had been weakening the rock structure over time, and the heat from the campfire the boys had used had created thermal stress that provided the final trigger for the collapse. For the 2 survivors, the psychological trauma of that night would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They had watched 3 friends die in an instant, crushed by falling rock while sleeping in what was supposed to be a safe camping spot. The randomness of who lived and who died, determined simply by where each person had been sleeping. On the afternoon of Monday, December 29th, 1980, 7 kids were doing what kids do during Christmas break, looking for adventure. They had gathered at the base of a sandstone cliff adjacent to the Quail Hollow Ranch near Ben Lomond in Santa Cruz County, California. It was the kind of gray, damp winter day that Northern California does so well. Fog had swept across the ridge that morning, and even though the rain had stopped after weeks of steady downpours, everything was still wet. The ground was damp. The rocks were slick. The air itself felt heavy with moisture. The cliff rose about 200 feet, 61 meters above them. Not a massive face, but tall enough to be impressive to a group of kids looking up at it. And about 5 feet, 1.5 meters from the top, carved into the sandstone by centuries of wind and water, was Cat's Cave. It wasn't really a cave in the traditional sense. It was what cavers call a shelter cave, basically a rock overhang, a shallow indentation in the cliff face about 3 feet, 0.9 meters deep. Nothing spectacular, nothing that would make it into any guidebook. Just a little hollow in the stone where you could sit and look out over the valley below. Local kids had been climbing up to it for years, carving their names into the soft sandstone, claiming their small piece of immortality in the rock. The 7 kids were having fun at the base, laughing and talking, probably telling each other stories about school or friends or whatever 14-year-olds talk about when they're trying to avoid going home. They were collecting fossils from the base of the cliff. The sandstone was full of them, ancient remnants of creatures that lived when this whole area was underwater, millions of years ago. At 4 p.m., as the winter sun was already starting to think about setting, 2 of the boys decided to climb up to Cat's Cave. Sean Carson was 14 years old. Steve McGovern was 12. They scrambled up the cliff face. Not a difficult climb, really, just picking your way up the sandstone, finding handholds and footholds, the way kids do when they're not thinking about how far they could fall. They reached Cat's Cave and pulled themselves into the shallow shelter. From up there, about 200 feet, 61 meters above the ground, they could see everything. The trees, the other kids below, looking like toys, the fog rolling in across the ridgeline. It must have felt like being on top of the world. Sean had brought something with him, a claw hammer, and he had a plan. He was going to do what generations of kids before him had done, carve his name into the ceiling of Cat's Cave, leave his mark, prove he'd been there. He raised the hammer and started pounding on the sandstone overhead, chipping away at the soft rock, creating letters, making noise that echoed off the cliff face. Steve watched, took a turn for himself too. Just 2 kids, hanging out in a shallow cave, doing something that seemed completely harmless. At approximately 4:15 p.m., there was a rumble. Not a loud crash, not an explosion, just a rumble, a low, grinding sound that came from the rock itself, like the mountain clearing its throat. And then the front upper portion of Cat's Cave ceiling, about 2 feet, 0.6 meters, of sandstone that had been hanging above their heads, let go. Sean Carson was buried completely. One moment he was there, hammer in hand, probably mid-swing. The next moment, he was under tons of rock. The sandstone slab that fell wasn't small, it was massive, heavy. The accumulated weight of ancient compressed sand that had been slowly weakening for years, held up by nothing but its own structural integrity and luck. Steve McGovern was buried up to his chest. He could move his arms, he could breathe. But from the chest down, he was pinned under debris, trapped in what remained of the shallow cave, and he started screaming. The 5 kids at the base of the cliff heard it immediately. Steve's voice, high-pitched and terrified, calling down to them from 200 feet, 61 meters up. They looked up and saw the cloud of dust, the changed shape of the cave entrance, and understood instantly that something terrible had happened. 3 of them started climbing immediately, scrambling up the cliff face as fast as they could, not thinking about safety, just knowing their friends needed help. The other 2 turned and ran, sprinting toward the nearest house to call for help, their feet pounding on the damp ground. The call went to the Ben Lomond Fire Department. A rescue squad was dispatched. They arrived at the scene in 10 minutes, remarkable response time, but when someone is buried under tons of rock, every second counts. Every heartbeat matters. The 3 kids who'd climbed up had already started trying to free Steve by hand, pulling at rocks, moving debris, working frantically. When the firefighters arrived, they brought equipment and experience, and they worked with controlled urgency, knowing that somewhere under all that rock, Sean Carson was buried completely. 5 minutes. That's how long it took to free both boys once the rescue squad arrived. 5 minutes of moving rock, piece by piece, careful not to cause another collapse, not to hurt the victims worse than they already were. Steve McGovern, the 12-year-old who'd been buried up to his chest, was uninjured, not a scratch on him. The rocks had fallen around him in just the right way, pinning him but not crushing him. When they pulled him free, he was shaken, terrified, probably in shock, but physically, he was fine. Sean Carson was under 2 feet, 0.6 meters of debris. When they finally uncovered him, after those 15 minutes of burial, 5 minutes of the initial firefighter response, plus the 10 minutes before they arrived, he had no pulse. He wasn't breathing. The firefighters had brought a Stokes litter, a rigid rescue stretcher designed for extracting victims from difficult terrain. They carefully placed Sean's body in it, lifted it over the edge of the cliff, and carried him down. An ambulance was waiting. They transported him immediately to Community Hospital in Santa Cruz, the medics probably working on him the entire way, doing CPR, trying to force his heart to start again, trying to make his lungs remember how to breathe. But when they arrived at the hospital, the doctors who examined Sean Carson declared what the firefighters had probably already known up on that cliff. The 14-year-old boy who'd been hammering his name into the sandstone, who'd been laughing with his friend just minutes before, who'd probably been thinking about what he was going to have for dinner that night, was dead. The official cause of death was straightforward: blunt force trauma and asphyxiation from being buried under rock. But the real question wasn't how Sean died. It was why the cave collapsed in the first place. Cat's Cave had been there for centuries, probably millennia. Kids had been climbing up to it and carving their names in it for decades. What made December 29th, 1980 different? The investigators who examined the scene afterward pieced together several factors. First, the weeks of preceding rainfall. Northern California had been getting hammered with winter storms, and all the water had been seeping into the sandstone, working its way into every crack and crevice in the rock. Sandstone is porous. Water doesn't run off it like it would off granite. It absorbs into the stone, and when it does, it changes the rock's properties. It makes it heavier. It makes it weaker. Second, the morning fog that had swept the ridge, more moisture, the dampness that made the ground damp, that made everything feel wet and cold, had also penetrated into the ceiling of Cat's Cave. The rock was saturated, weakened, holding more weight than it was designed to hold. Third, and most critically, was what Sean had been doing: the hammering, the pounding on the ceiling of the cave. Every blow of that claw hammer sent vibrations through the sandstone. Every chip he knocked loose changed the structural integrity of the rock above him. And that ceiling was already stressed, already weakened by moisture, already on the verge of failure. He didn't know. How could he have known? Kids had been hammering names into that cave for years, but caves don't fail gradually. They fail suddenly. 1 minute the rock is holding. The next minute, it isn't. There's no warning, no groaning or cracking that gives you time to get out of the way. Just a rumble, and then tons of stone falling at the speed of gravity. During the summer of 1988, 5 spelunkers gathered at the entrance of a Kentucky cave for what should have been a routine expedition as part of a larger caving festival. What they encountered just inside the entrance would turn their trip into a terrifying encounter with an invisible hazard that could easily kill every person who entered inside. And no, it wasn't toxic gas exposure or oxygen deprivation. The Kentucky Spellfest was an annual gathering of cave explorers from across the region who came together to explore cave systems, share knowledge, and participate in organized field trips to various caves in the area. The event was held near Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky, a region that's absolutely riddled with limestone cave systems, some of the most extensive cave networks in the entire world. One of the scheduled field trips for that year's Speleofest was to Wig Pissel Cave, a system that apparently required passing through a water-filled entrance to access the dry passages beyond. This wasn't unusual for Kentucky caves. Many systems have low, wet entrances that open up into larger passages once you get past the initial obstacles. On this particular Saturday morning, 5 spelunkers gathered at the entrance to Wig Pissel Cave, ready to begin their expedition. They had all the standard equipment: wetsuits for the water passage, headlamps, helmets, and whatever other gear they needed for the cave beyond. The group had a designated leader, Gary Schindel, who was presumably experienced enough to lead the trip safely. But before they entered the cave, the group received a warning that should have made them reconsider the entire expedition. They were told that the landowner who owned the property where the cave entrance was located had installed an electric pump in the pool just inside the low entrance. This pump was used to control water levels in the entrance area, probably to prevent flooding or to maintain access to the cave. The warning was specific and alarming: do not touch the wires, and do not be in the pool when the pump comes on. This should have been an immediate red flag to any responsible person. Electricity and water are a deadly combination. and voluntarily entering a pool of water that contains electrical equipment is asking for a fatal accident. But for reasons that aren't clear, the group decided to proceed with the trip, despite this obvious danger. The party donned their wetsuits, which would provide some thermal protection from the cold water, and some minimal insulation from rocks and rough surfaces. 2 members of the group entered the cave first, carefully traversing the pump pool at the entrance. They would have been moving through water that was probably chest deep in a low passage where they couldn't stand upright, making their way past the electric pump and its associated wiring toward the dry passages beyond. As these 2 moved through the pool, they began experiencing what they described as tingling sensations. They reported these sensations back to the other 3 who were still outside the entrance, probably calling out through the low passage that something felt wrong with the water. Those tingling sensations were not their imagination, and they weren't caused by cold water or anything benign. What they were experiencing was electrical current passing through the water and through their bodies. They were being shocked, not with enough voltage to cause immediate incapacitation or death, but with enough current to create noticeable sensations that something was very wrong. Here's what's terrifying about this situation. Electricity and water doesn't create a single path from point A to point B. Instead, electrical current spreads out through the water in all directions from the source, creating what's essentially a sphere of energized water. Anyone in that sphere becomes part of the circuit, with electricity flowing through their body from entry points to exit points. The tingling sensations these guys were experiencing meant that electrical current was already flowing through their bodies. Whether this was because the pump was running, or because there was faulty wiring creating a ground fault, or some other electrical problem, the result was the same. The water in the entrance pool was energized with potentially lethal current. When the 3 cavers who were still outside heard their companions, they immediately understood the gravity of the situation. This could easily escalate into full muscular contractions, respiratory paralysis, cardiac arrest, or any number of other effects of electrical shock that could kill someone in a matter of seconds. Giri Schindel, as the leader of the group, made the decision to go to the landowner's house and cut the power to the pump. This was absolutely the right call. Continuing into the cave with an electrical hazard in the entrance pool would have been suicidal, but executing this plan created its own set of problems and dangers. First, Schindel had to leave the cave entrance and locate the landowner's house, which presumably wasn't right at the cave entrance, or the group would have dealt with the power issue before anyone entered the water. Second, when Schindel reached the house and cut the power, he discovered that the landowner was not home. This created an enormous problem because it meant there was no way to guarantee that the power wouldn't be turned back on. The landowner could return home at any time, see that the power had been switched off, and flip it back on without having any idea that there were people in the cave who would be electrocuted if the pump came on while they were in the water. However, after about 15 minutes, Schindel came jogging back to the cave entrance, slightly out of breath. He said he had found the breaker box and cut the power. The pump was definitely off now, but since the owner wasn't home, he could come back, find that the pump was disabled, and turn it back on. The group discussed whether they should continue with the trip. They had come all this way, and it seemed like they had a window of opportunity to get through the entrance pool safely. One of them, the same one who had exited after feeling the tingling earlier, was particularly confident that the danger had passed. The other party members were less certain, but the confident member was already pulling his wetsuit back into position and checking his gear. He volunteered to go first and test the water. The others called out warnings to be careful, to maybe test the water first before committing fully. But the confident one waved off their concerns. He stepped into the water and moved forward into the low entrance passage. For a few seconds, everything seemed fine. The water felt normal. No unusual sensations. Then he took another step forward, moving deeper into the pool toward where the pump was located. In an instant, his entire world exploded into agony. The electrical current hit him like a physical assault. His body went completely rigid, every muscle contracting violently and simultaneously. The pain was beyond anything he had ever experienced, like being stabbed with 1,000 knives while simultaneously having every muscle torn from the bone. He tried to scream, but his jaw was clenched so tightly that only a strangled, inhuman sound emerged from his throat. He couldn't move forward, couldn't move backward, couldn't even fall down. The electrical current flowing through his body had completely overridden his nervous system, turning him into a living statue frozen in the electrified pool. Others watching from outside saw his body go rigid. Then they heard the sound, that horrible noise coming from their companion's throat as he tried unsuccessfully to scream through his clenched jaw. They understood immediately what had happened. Despite Schindel cutting the power, the pool was still energized. The other members knew they had only seconds to act. If they didn't get their companion out of that water immediately, he was going to die right in front of them. But they also knew they couldn't just reach in and grab him. If they touched the water or made contact with him while he was being shocked, the current would flow through them as well. One of them frantically rushed outside and looked around the entrance area for something, anything, they could use to reach their trapped companion without conducting the electricity. His eyes landed on a piece of old, weathered wood near the entrance. It was part of a broken board, probably discarded years ago, now half rotted and covered in moss. But it was long enough to reach into the pool, and wood, especially dry wood, is a relatively poor conductor of electricity. He grabbed the board and thrust it toward the trapped companion, trying to get close enough to make contact. The trapped caver's body was still rigid, his face contorted in a mask of pain that was horrible to witness. The caver with the board pushed it into the water, gambling that the waterlogged wood wouldn't conduct enough current to shock him through his grip on the dry end, and tried to hook it against the trapped man's chest or under his arm. The goal was to use the board to physically push or drag him backward out of the electrified water. Time was running out. Two of the outside the water worked together, one holding the rescuer's legs to keep him from falling into the electrified pool while the other used the board. They managed to wedge the board behind the trapped caver and began pushing him backward through the water. It wasn't elegant or efficient. They were essentially using the board like a plow, trying to move a rigid human body through chest-deep water without falling in themselves. The trapped man's feet dragged uselessly along the rocky bottom as they pushed him. He was a dead weight being shoved through the water by people who were terrified that they might lose their grip, or the board would slip, or the current would kill him before they could bring him out. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, they managed to push the trapped man out of the water using the board. The moment his body cleared the pool, the electrical circuit was broken and the current stopped flowing through him. The man collapsed immediately onto the muddy ground outside the entrance. His muscles, which had been locked in painful contraction for what felt like forever, finally relaxed. His companions quickly checked him over. His arms and legs were twitching involuntarily. His heart was skipping beats as it tried to recover from the electrical assault. His skin showed reddened areas where the current had entered and exited his body, burns that would worsen. But miraculously, he was alive. He had survived being electrocuted in water, something that kills most people. His overconfidence had nearly cost him his life, but the quick thinking of his companions and sheer luck had saved him. The group immediately abandoned any thought of continuing the cave trip. They helped their shocked companion to his feet and supported him as they made their way back to where vehicles were parked. He needed medical attention to make sure the electrical shock hadn't caused any lasting damage to his heart or other organs. Miraculously, he had survived and was treated for only burns. In January 1988, a film crew descended deep into one of Mexico's most extensive cave systems for a 9-day underground expedition. Sistema Huautla sits in Oaxaca, Mexico, and is one of the deepest cave systems in the Western Hemisphere. The system is accessed through an entrance called Sotano San Agustin, which leads down through a series of vertical drops and passages to depths that require multiple days to reach. The cave is so vast and complex that serious expeditions require establishing underground camps at various levels to allow exploration of the deeper sections. In late January 1988, a sizable crew of cave enthusiasts entered Sistema Huautla with an ambitious plan. They would descend to the Sala Grande de la Sierra Mazateca, a massive chamber deep within the system, and establish a 9-day underground camp. The expedition was primarily supporting the Huautla Project, a documentary film about cave exploration in this remarkable system. The crew made their descent through Sistema Huautla, navigating the series of rope drops and passages that led deeper and deeper underground. The crew had rigged complex rope systems with rebelays, knots, rope pads, and bolts to navigate the various pitches. They carried all the equipment and supplies needed for a 9-day stay in the cave: food, water, sleeping gear, filming equipment, and camping stoves for cooking meals. Once they reached their destination chamber, they established their underground camp and settled in for their extended stay in the darkness. For the next few days, they kept on filming and exploring even deeper into the cave system. Everyone took turns preparing meals for each day. One day, Bill Steele was assigned the cooking duty. He pulled out one of their MSR Whisperlight camping stoves, a popular lightweight stove commonly used by backpackers and spelunkers. The stove was fueled with Mexican unleaded gasoline, which is extremely volatile and flammable, similar to Coleman fuel or white gas used in camping stoves throughout North America. Steele began the routine process of preparing the stove to cook dinner for the crew. He pumped up the pressure in the stove's fuel tank, a necessary step that forces the liquid fuel through the burner, where it vaporizes and ignites. This is a procedure that thousands of adventurers perform safely every day. But something went catastrophically wrong with Steele's stove. The moment he finished pumping pressure into the tank and flicked the lighter, it detonated. Not a flare, a violent explosion, a compressed firebomb of gasoline vapor that erupted point blank in the cramped underground camp. The explosion sent burning gasoline spraying in all directions. In less than a second, Bill Steele was fully engulfed in fire. The darkness turned into chaos. Steele stumbled backward, a human torch, screaming as liquid fire crawled up his back, wrapping around his arms, eating through clothing like acid. His teammates lunged at him, but nothing worked. He was shouting and thrashing as the flames consumed him, the pain immediate and excruciating. One of them tried smothering the flames with his jacket. The fire blew straight through it. Another threw water from bottles. Useless. The fuel kept burning like sticky molten plastic, spreading instead of dying. Steele's voice was no longer even words, just raw animal panic. Finally, one teammate tackled him to the ground, forcing Steele face down into the cave mud, while another used soaked gear bags and bare, blistering hands to physically smother every inch of flame. And in that final desperate attempt, the fire died. But the damage was already irreversible. Steele's back was cooked raw, and his right hand destroyed. These weren't minor burns that would heal in a few days. These were second and third degree burns. The injuries to his hand were particularly gruesome. The skin was literally hanging in tatters from his palm, exposing the raw flesh beneath. In that moment, one thing became brutally clear. If they didn't evacuate him immediately, Steele wasn't making it out alive. But here's the terrible reality of their situation. They were deep inside one of Mexico's most extensive cave systems, multiple days' travel from the surface. There was no way to call for emergency evacuation, no helicopter rescue option, no ambulance waiting at the entrance. If Bill Steele was going to get medical treatment, he would have to climb out of the cave himself. The crew administered what first aid they could, with the limited medical supplies available in their underground camp. They gave Steele Tylenol 3 for the pain, a prescription painkiller that would help, but was nowhere near adequate for the level of agony he was experiencing. 2 volunteered to accompany Steele on his exit from the cave. They gathered essential gear and began the ascent, leaving the rest of the crew to continue with the expedition or break camp, depending on the circumstances. The route out of Sistema Huautla was punishing under normal circumstances. It involved climbing numerous vertical rope drops, some of them massive, plus navigating difficult horizontal passages and challenging climbs. Steele would be attempting this ascent with severe burns covering his back and his right hand essentially destroyed. Every movement would be agony. The first major obstacle they encountered was the gorge, located just above their camp. Under normal conditions, the gorge involved some swimming through underground streams and negotiating wet passages. But the expedition had experienced rain on the surface, and that water had filtered down into the cave system, swelling the underground stream to dangerous levels. Where there had been easy swims on the way down, there was now a raging current powerful enough to sweep a person away. Steele and his two companions had to cling desperately to the walls, finding handholds and footholds to make their way against the current. For Steele, with his badly burned hand, gripping the wet rock was a torture. Halfway through their ascent, they encountered two expedition members who had been making their way down to join the main camp. These late arrivals had fortunately noticed the heavy water flow and had taken the time to re-rig some of the rope drops to avoid the worst of the flooding. Steele began the series of rope climbs that would take him back to the surface. The first major pitch was 77 meters, 253 feet, of vertical rope climbing. Then 35 meters, 115 feet. Then 8 meters, 26 feet. Then a massive 60 meter, 197 feet climb. Then 15 meters, 49 feet. Then an even more massive 110 meter, 361 feet climb. And finally, a truly enormous 150 meter, 492 feet rope climb, nearly 500 feet of vertical ascent, while suffering from severe burns. And those were just the major rope drops. There were also 17 shorter rope climbs scattered throughout the route, plus several arduous face climbs in a section called the Fool's Day Extension, climbing moves that required using hands and feet on the rock face. Exactly the kind of activity that would be agonizing with burned hands and back. The pain Steele experienced during this ascent was beyond imagination. The Tylenol 3 they had given him was completely inadequate for injuries this severe. He occasionally screamed in pain as he climbed, the agony overwhelming his ability to stay silent. But somehow, through sheer determination and willpower, he kept climbing. The ascent took 11 hours of continuous climbing through pain that would have broken most people. 11 hours of using burned hands to grip ropes and rock. 11 hours of his injured back rubbing against equipment and cave walls. 11 hours of pushing through agony that made him scream, but never made him quit. When Steele finally emerged from the cave entrance and reached the surface, he had accomplished something remarkable. He had climbed out of one of the deepest cave systems in the Western Hemisphere, while suffering from second and third degree burns that should have incapacitated him completely. Steele was immediately transported to a hospital where he could receive proper treatment for his burns. The medical staff cleaned and dressed his wounds, administered adequate pain medication, and began the long process of burn treatment and recovery. The doctors confirmed he had suffered second and third degree burns on his back and hand, injuries that would require extensive care and healing time. Remarkably, despite the severity of his burns and the brutal 11-hour climb through Sistema Huautla, Steele would suffer no permanent damage from the incident. On March 19, 1983, three spelunkers spent 10 hours exploring a West Virginia cave system. During their exploration, all three had perfect vision, but as they prepared to exit, something terrible happened. The cave system in West Virginia has a challenging environment that requires serious technical skills to navigate. The entrance was accessed by climbing down through a series of vertical drops and climbs, and the cave extended deep underground through passages that included tight squeezes through breakdown, collapsed rock that created narrow gaps between massive boulders. On this particular March day, three experienced cave explorers entered the system for what they expected to be a thorough exploration. Kent Sievers was 30 years old and part of a group that understood the risks and challenges of serious caving. They were all using carbide lamps for illumination, a traditional caving light source that works by dripping water onto calcium carbide pellets, producing acetylene gas that burns with a bright, steady flame. Carbide lamps had been the standard for cavers for decades. They're reliable, they produce good light, and they can run for hours on a single charge of carbide. But they also produce acetylene gas, which is extremely flammable and explosive when mixed with air in the right proportions. The three spent 10 hours underground, exploring the passages and chambers of the cave system. By the time they decided to start their exit, they were deep in the system with a substantial journey ahead of them to reach the surface. As they began their exit, making their way back through the passages toward the entrance, they reached a point roughly halfway out. They were still below the 6th climb that would lead them to the entrance, meaning they still had multiple vertical climbs ahead of them, plus all the horizontal passages and tight squeezes that lay between their current position and the surface. The group decided to stop and refill their carbide lamps before continuing. After 10 hours of burning, their lamps were running low on carbide, and they wanted to make sure they had adequate light for the remainder of the exit. Kent Sievers opened his pack to access his supply of calcium carbide. The pack was made of ballistic nylon, a tough, tightly woven material designed to withstand the abuse of caving. What Sievers didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that his ballistic nylon pack had become essentially gas-tight. The tight weave of the material, combined with how the pack was sealed, had created an enclosed space where acetylene gas had been building up throughout their 10-hour expedition. Here's what had been happening inside Sievers' pack. The calcium carbide pellets he was carrying had somehow gotten wet, probably from condensation or water vapor in the cave atmosphere. When calcium carbide gets wet, even slightly damp, it immediately begins producing acetylene gas. Over the course of 10 hours, with carbide slowly reacting with moisture inside the gas-tight pack, a significant quantity of acetylene had accumulated. Acetylene is lighter than air and extremely flammable. When mixed with oxygen in concentrations between 2.5% and 100%, it becomes explosively combustible. Inside Sievers' sealed pack, the conditions were perfect for a catastrophic event. As Sievers opened his pack in the darkness of the cave, with his carbide lamp burning just inches away, the accumulated acetylene gas rushed out of the pack into the air. The moment the gas made contact with the flame from his carbide lamp, it ignited. The explosion was instantaneous and devastating. A tremendous fireball erupted in the confined space of the cave passage, centered directly on Kent Sievers' face. His companions saw the flash of the explosion and the fireball that consumed Sievers. The confined space of the cave passage probably amplified the blast, and for a moment they feared the worst, that Sievers had been killed by the explosion right in front of them. The acetylene burned with intense heat, creating a ball of flame that engulfed his head before anyone could even react. When the flames dissipated seconds later, Sievers was still standing, but something was terribly wrong. The acetylene fireball had burned his face severely. His eyebrows had been singed completely away, but worse, much worse, he couldn't see anything. Sievers blinked frantically, trying to clear his vision. Nothing. He blinked again, harder, still nothing. Just absolute blackness. No light from the carbide lamps, no shadows, no shapes. Complete and total darkness. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was blind, both eyes, gone. Panic seized Sievers immediately. He brought his hands up to his face, touching his eyes, feeling around them desperately, as if he could somehow diagnose what was wrong, as if touching them would make his vision return. His breathing became rapid and shallow, his chest heaving as terror overwhelmed his rational thinking. He was making sounds, not quite words, more like panicked cries and half-formed attempts to speak that caught in his throat. He was on the verge of complete psychological breakdown, his mind unable to process the sudden catastrophic loss of his vision. His two companions immediately understood what was happening. Sievers wasn't just injured, he was spiraling into full panic, and if they didn't get him under control immediately, he could hurt himself even worse by falling or running into obstacles in his blind, terrified state. One of the companions grabbed Sievers firmly by the shoulders, stopping his frantic movement. The other moved close, both of them now holding him, keeping him still. They started talking to him, their voices calm and steady despite their own fear. Sievers was still making those panic sounds, but gradually, over several minutes that felt like hours, Sievers' breathing began to slow. Sievers came back to his senses. The animal panic subsided, replaced by a more controlled fear. He was still blind, still terrified. But he was thinking again instead of just reacting. When he could finally speak coherently, his voice was shaking but functional. He asked them what had happened, though he already knew. He asked if they could see any damage to his eyes. They examined his face as best they could by the light of their carbide lamps and told him his eyebrows were singed away and his face was burned, but his eyes looked intact, no obvious trauma that they could see. This information helped calm Sievers further. If his eyes weren't physically destroyed, maybe his vision would come back and the damage was temporary. The three explorers immediately assessed their situation. They were faced with a critical decision. Should they try to self-rescue and get Sievers out of the cave using their own abilities, or should they send for help and wait for a rescue team to arrive? Several factors pushed them toward attempting a self-rescue. First, the cave environment was cold and damp, and Sievers was at serious risk of hypothermia if they waited for hours for a rescue team to arrive and organize an extraction. Second, his eye injuries appeared to need urgent professional medical care. Every hour of delay could potentially mean the difference between recovering his vision and permanent blindness. Third, they were experienced cave explorers who understood the cave system and felt capable of guiding Sievers out despite his blindness. They made the decision to attempt the exit immediately, with Sievers climbing blind while his companions guided him. Between their current position and the entrance, the challenges were formidable. They still had to negotiate several tricky vertical climbs, where Sievers would need to use his hands and feet to ascend rock faces and rope systems. They had to pass through a section of breakdown, where tight squeezes between massive boulders required precise body positioning to fit through the gaps. And they had to do all of this with Sievers unable to see where he was putting his hands and feet. The group began their ascent, with Sievers climbing on belay. His companions positioned themselves above and below him, providing constant verbal instructions for every movement. For the vertical climbs, Sievers had to trust completely in his peers for directions. They would tell him where to place his hands, where to move his feet, when to push up, when to reach for the next hold. The psychological challenge of climbing blind in a cave cannot be overstated. Sievers couldn't see the holds he was reaching for, couldn't judge distances or angles, couldn't see the exposure below him. Every movement required absolute faith in his companion's words and in his own abilities. After successfully conquering the climb, came in the next obstacle, the breakdown section. This breakdown section presented different challenges. In breakdown passages, one has to squeeze through tight gaps between massive boulders, often contorting their bodies into awkward positions to fit through the available space. This is difficult enough with full vision, but doing it blind requires a completely different approach. Sievers' companions developed a system for guiding him through the tight squeezes. One would go ahead through the squeeze, and Sievers would keep one hand on that companion's foot, using it as a tactile guide. He would feel which direction the foot moved, understand how the passage turned or narrowed, and follow the same path by keeping constant contact with his guide's foot. This technique required the leading person to move slowly and deliberately, maintaining constant communication with Sievers about what was coming next. It required Sievers to move entirely by feel, using his hands to explore the rock surfaces around him, judging the size of gaps by touch alone. The squeezes were particularly nerve-wracking because they involved committing to tight spaces where backing out would be difficult or impossible. Sievers had to wedge himself into gaps between boulders without being able to see how much space was available or whether he would actually fit through. The entire exit took considerably longer than a normal trip out of the cave would have taken. Every movement had to be carefully explained and executed. Every obstacle approached with extra caution. Every decision made with Sievers' blindness as the primary consideration. But, remarkably, the group made it to the entrance without any further incidents. Through careful communication, patient guidance, and Sievers' own courage and determination. When they finally emerged from the cave into daylight, which Sievers couldn't see, he was immediately taken for medical evaluation of his eye injuries. The burns on his face were painful, but relatively minor. The real concern was his vision. After a couple of weeks of medical treatment and recovery, Sievers' eyesight gradually returned to normal. The blindness that had seemed so permanent in the immediate aftermath of the explosion proved to be temporary, and he made a complete recovery. On the evening of March 20th, 2002, two young men decided to explore a cave they had discovered near a suburban golf course in Knoxville, Tennessee, armed with nothing more than a rope and a flashlight. Only one of them would climb back out on his own. 10 Mile Pit is located in an unusual setting for a cave, right next to a golf course in a suburban neighborhood of Knoxville, Tennessee. The cave entrance had been gated by authorities specifically to prevent unauthorized access. But like many gated caves, determined people could sometimes find ways around the security measures. Joel Brooks was 24 years old, and Josh Allman was 23 in March 2002. A few days before this incident, the two friends had been exploring around the golf course area when they stumbled across the cave entrance. They found the gate open when they discovered it. On Wednesday evening, Brooks and Allman decided to return to 10 Mile Pit and explore the cave system beyond the entrance drop. They arrived at the golf course area and made their way to the cave entrance, carrying minimal equipment for their adventure. But here's the critical mistake that Brooks and Allman made. A mistake that left a lifetime trauma. They decided to explore a 75-foot vertical cave entrance with nothing more than a rope and a flashlight. No helmets, no climbing harnesses, no belay devices, no proper safety equipment whatsoever. They probably had no idea where to get the best equipment from. The 10 Mile Pit was structured in 4 distinct sections, each presenting its own challenges. First, there was an initial free drop of 15 feet, 4.6 meters, a vertical section where you couldn't touch the walls and needed to either rappel on rope or free climb down. Second, there was a mud slope about 40 feet, 12 meters long, that was steep and slippery. Third, there was a 10-foot, 3-meter climb down to a ledge. And finally, there was a 20-foot, 6-meter drop to a stream at the bottom of the pit. Beyond this entrance pit, several thousand feet of cave passages extended into the limestone bedrock, an extensive system that would be fascinating to explore for anyone interested in caving. But you had to safely navigate that 75-foot entrance pit first, both on the way in and on the way out. The two men began their descent into 10 Mile Pit. They navigated the initial 15-foot free drop. They made their way down the 40-foot mud slope and reached the 10-foot climb down to the ledge and negotiated that section successfully. They were now at the top of the final 20-foot drop to the stream below, the last obstacle before they could access the horizontal cave passages that extended beyond the entrance pit. Josh Allman was near the top of this final climb when he lost his purchase on the rock. In climbing terms, losing purchase means losing your grip or foothold, the contact points between your body and the rock face that keep you attached to the wall. In a fraction of a second, Allman went from being in control of his descent to falling uncontrollably through the air. He tumbled down the slope, his body bouncing and rolling against the rock and mud, completely unable to arrest his fall or control his trajectory. Allman went over the final 20-foot drop and fell through the air before landing hard beside the stream at the bottom of the pit. The impact was brutal. His body hit the rocky floor with tremendous force. Brooks, who had been above or behind Allman during the descent, watched in horror as his friend fell. When the sound of Allman's body hitting the bottom echoed up through the pit, Brooks immediately knew this was serious. He called down to Allman, trying to assess his condition. Allman responded, which meant he was conscious and alive, but he was clearly badly injured. He told Brooks that he had hurt his shoulder and his head in the fall and couldn't climb back up. The pain and damage from the impact had left him unable to use his arms effectively enough to make the climb back up the rope. Brooks faced a terrible dilemma. His friend was injured at the bottom with perhaps a life-threatening injury, unable to climb out on his own. Brooks could either stay with Allman and try to help him, or he could climb out and get professional rescue assistance. But if he climbed down to help, would he be able to get back out himself? And if he stayed down there with Allman, would they both end up dead? Brooks made the decision to climb down to his friend and try to help him. He descended the rest of the way into the pit and found Allman in significant pain from his injuries. Brooks tried to help Allman climb by pulling him, supporting him, and doing whatever he could to assist his friend's ascent. But it quickly became clear that this wasn't going to work. Almon's shoulder injury was too severe for him to do the climbing movements, and the head injury made him unstable. Brooks chose to get help. He told Almon he was going to climb out and bring back a rescue team. Brooks began his solo ascent of the entrance pit. When he emerged from the cave entrance next to the golf course, he immediately ran across the fairway of the 18th hole toward the nearest house. Golfers and residents watched in surprise as this mud-covered young man came sprinting across the golf course, obviously in distress and urgently seeking help. Brooks reached a house and summoned emergency services, explaining that his friend was trapped at the bottom of a cave pit with serious injuries and couldn't climb out. The call went out to the Knox County Cave Rescue Team, specialists trained in technical rope rescue and cave extraction operations. The rescue team arrived at the scene and quickly assessed the situation. They had a patient at the bottom of a 75-foot entrance pit with a head and shoulder injury and possibly other trauma from a significant fall. They would need to descend into the pit, stabilize the patient, package him properly for a vertical lift, and haul him back to the surface. As the rescue operation got underway, a crowd began to gather. Golfers who had been playing the 18th hole stopped to watch. Residents from the nearby houses came out to see what was happening at the cave entrance next to their golf course. It wasn't every day that a technical cave rescue unfolded in a suburban neighborhood. The rescue team rigged their rope systems at the top of the pit, setting up proper anchors and establishing the mechanical advantage systems they would need to haul an incapacitated patient up 75 feet of vertical terrain. They descended into the pit with professional equipment and expertise, reaching Almon at the bottom beside the stream. The rescuers examined Almon and determined his injuries from his fall. They placed him on a backboard to stabilize his spine, then packaged him in a rescue litter, a specialized stretcher designed for vertical rescue operations. They secured him with straps and padding to prevent any additional injury during the hauling operation. Then came the challenging part, hauling Almon up through the 75-foot entrance pit. The rescue team used their mechanical advantage systems to slowly lift the litter, with team members stationed at various points along the route to guide the litter past obstacles and prevent it from snagging on rock features or getting wedged in narrow sections. The entire rescue operation took about 2 hours from the time the rescue team arrived until Almon was safely on the surface. When they finally brought him up out of the pit in front of the crowd of golfers and residents, he was immediately transported to a hospital for treatment of his head and shoulder injury and broken fingers. He was in severe medical care, but was alive. Authorities were less sympathetic to the duo's adventure. Trespassing charges were reportedly under consideration since the cave entrance was gated and the two men had no authorization to be there. Officials also stated that the cave gate would be repaired to prevent future unauthorized entries. The fact that Almon survived his fall was remarkably fortunate. Falls in caves can easily be fatal, and a 30-foot tumbling fall ending with a 20-foot drop could have resulted in much more serious injuries, including death. In June of 1985, 3 kids from San Antonio, Texas, Eddie, Marco, and Luke, decided to chase the adventure of a lifetime. What they didn't realize was that their idea of fun would cost them their lives. The summer of 1985 was one of imagination. Across America, kids were mesmerized by an adventure movie about a group of children who followed a treasure map into a labyrinth of underground tunnels, surviving traps, finding gold, and saving their town. It was the kind of movie that made danger look fun, a blend of courage, friendship, and discovery wrapped into one perfect fantasy. For most kids, the adventure ended when the credits rolled, but for 3 friends living just north of San Antonio, it was only the beginning. Eddie, the ringleader, was 11, Marco was 10, and Luke was the youngest at 9. Together, they spent most of their summer days exploring the fields, climbing fences, and daring each other to go farther than the last. Their small Texas neighborhood sat on land riddled with limestone. Beneath the soil were sinkholes, cracks, and caves, the result of rainwater slowly dissolving rock over thousands of years. To the boys, this hidden world beneath their feet seemed magical. They had heard adults talk about wild caves, but few had ever seen one. So, naturally, they wanted to find one themselves. It didn't take long. On a humid afternoon in early June, while wandering through an overgrown patch of brush about 5 miles north of town, Eddie spotted a depression in the ground. When they cleared away the weeds, they found a dark slit in the limestone, barely big enough for a person to crawl through. Cool air flowed steadily from the opening. It was the first real cave they had ever seen. For kids who had just watched a movie about treasure hunting adventures in caves, finding this cave entrance must have felt like destiny. Here was their chance to have a real adventure, to explore an unknown cave system, to potentially find treasure just like the characters in the movie they had watched. Excitement overwhelmed reason. They didn't tell anyone where they were going. They had no maps, no ropes, no helmets. Between them, they carried 2 flashlights and a small paper bag of snacks. To them, that was enough. They weren't planning to go far, just far enough to see what was inside and look for treasure. As they crouched and stepped into the entrance, the temperature dropped instantly. They laughed at the echoing sound, moving deeper and deeper into tight passageways. At first, the cave seemed like no threat whatsoever. The floor was uneven but manageable. Each twist and turn felt like progress towards something hidden. The X marks the spot that every kid dreamed of finding. But as they penetrated deeper into the cave system, things began to change. The passages became more complex, with multiple routes branching off in different directions. The natural light from the entrance faded until they were completely dependent on whatever lighting they had brought. The cave environment was completely foreign to them. They didn't understand how to navigate underground, how to mark their route, or how to ensure they could find their way back. They didn't realize it yet, but they had already gone too far. Eddie led the way into a sloping passage that eventually shrank to a crawl space. He wriggled through first, followed by Marco and Luke. The walls pressed tight on all sides. At one point, Marco's movement stopped. The tunnel had pinched around his chest, and his back wedged against the stone. He tried to shift, but the rock gripped tighter. Panic erupted instantly. His breath quickened as he struggled to move. For several tense minutes, the other 2 clawed at the ground, pulling and pushing, until finally Marco slid forward, gasping with relief. They sat in silence afterward, too frightened to move. The fun had evaporated completely. They started realizing that was not just dangerous, but scary for kids of their age. The only thing they could think of was to get out as soon as they could. But when they did, the way behind them didn't look simple. That's when they knew they had a serious problem. They couldn't find the way out. The passages that had seemed straightforward on the way in now looked confusing and unfamiliar. In the limited light, everything looked the same. Gray limestone walls, rocky floors, passages branching in multiple directions. The kids tried retracing their steps, but without having marked their route or paid careful attention to landmarks on the way in, they had no reliable way to navigate back to the entrance. They wandered through the passages, trying different routes, each time hoping this would be the passage that led back to daylight. But instead of finding the entrance, they just found more passages, more chambers, more confusion. The cave that had seemed like an exciting adventure was now becoming a terrifying maze with no apparent exit. As time passed, the kids' situation became increasingly desperate. Their light was failing, leaving them in complete darkness. They were getting tired, thirsty, and scared. The excitement of the treasure hunting adventure had been completely replaced by the terror of being lost underground with no idea how to get out. By late evening, exhaustion had set in. They sat in a small chamber, shivering in the dark. The temperature underground hovered around 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 21 degrees Celsius, mild by any measure. But in damp air, with no food, no proper clothing, and no movement, their bodies began to lose heat rapidly. They didn't know it, but the first signs of hypothermia were appearing. Their lips turned pale, their hands shook uncontrollably, and their thoughts slowed. Above ground, the sun set, and still none of the boys had returned home. Eddie's mother was the first to notice. She walked through the neighborhood calling his name, then went to Marco's house. By then, Luke's parents had also realized he was missing. Fear spread quickly. The parents searched the nearby fields by flashlight, calling until their voices broke. When they found no trace, they contacted the police. By midnight, a full search effort was underway. Officers combed the wooded area north of town, while volunteers fanned out on foot. At some point, either through talking with friends of the children or finding some clue about where they had been planning to go, the parents learned about the cave. Someone mentioned hearing the boys talk earlier that week about finding treasure underground, just like the characters did in the famous movie Goonies. That single comment changed everything. The parents and authorities immediately understood that their children might be trapped underground and needed help. At dawn, a searcher spotted a patch of disturbed brush on a rocky hillside. Beneath it was a narrow opening, the entrance to the cave. Rescue teams arrived within the hour. Unlike the children, these were experienced cave explorers, men and women trained to navigate tight, unstable tunnels. They brought helmets, headlamps, radios, and long reels of safety line to mark their routes. The first rescuers entered the cave at sunrise. The descent was slow. The passages were narrow and uneven, often requiring them to crawl or drag gear behind them. They called the boys names, listening for any sound in return. But in a cave, sound behaves strangely. It bends, echoes, and dies unpredictably. It was impossible to tell whether any response was real or imagined. For the kids trapped underground, the wait was absolutely terrifying. They were in darkness, lost in a maze of passages, not knowing if anyone even knew they were missing or if help was coming. They huddled together for warmth and comfort, trying to stay calm while fighting the panic that comes from being trapped in an enclosed underground space with no apparent way out. They were now severely hypothermic and had little time left. As daylight returned above, the rescuers below continued deeper. They marked each turn with bright tape and mapped every section to avoid losing their own way. Hours stretched on. They found a torn paper bag of snacks. That confirmed it. The boys were inside. By evening, the rescue expanded. More volunteers arrived from nearby counties, bringing thermal blankets and medical kits. Above ground, parents waited in silence, staring at the cave entrance as the light faded again. It was now over 24 hours since anyone had seen the children. Inside, the boys were scared to death. They had stopped shouting. They pressed against each other, unaware that their body heat was the only thing keeping them alive. They drifted in and out of consciousness. Their sense of time was now collapsing. 32 hours after they first entered the cave, a rescuer crawling through a side tunnel heard something faint, a noise that didn't belong. It was a low, wavering sound, almost like wind at first. Then he realized it was crying. The team followed the sound into a small chamber barely large enough to crouch in. There, in the beam of their lights, they found the three boys, filthy, trembling, and barely responsive. Their flashlights were dead, their skin cold to the touch. They were alive, but just barely. Blankets were wrapped around them immediately. Warm fluids were administered. One by one, they were guided out. A slow, meticulous process that took nearly hours. When they finally emerged into daylight, the crowd at the surface broke into tears. Their parents rushed forward as rescuers carried the boys to waiting ambulances. They were admitted in the nearby hospital, where all three were treated for hypothermia and dehydration. Soon they started recovering. While physically they were getting better, mentally the experience stayed with them. They had gone looking for treasure. Instead, they found something far more valuable, the chance to live another day. High in the misty hills of Kodaikanal, Tamil Nadu, at an elevation of 7,317 feet, 2,230 meters above sea level, there's a place that locals refuse to visit after dark. They call it the Devil's Kitchen, though tourists know it by a different name, the Guna Caves. The caves weren't always called Guna. For generations, they were known simply as the Devil's Kitchen, a network of massive granite boulders stacked precariously on top of each other, creating narrow passages, dark chambers, and hidden pits that drop straight down into the mountain's core. Then, in 1991, a psychological thriller named Guna was filmed there, and since then, the name stuck. The movie made the caves famous, But fame didn't make them any less deadly. By 2006, 13 people had fallen into the caves and never come out. The bodies of most were never recovered. Local guides would tell you stories about how the caves seemed to call to people, how visitors would wander away from their groups, drawn deeper into the darkness until they simply disappeared. The forest department had put up fences. They'd installed warning signs. But the signs were in Tamil, and most tourists couldn't read them. What made the Guna Caves so deadly wasn't just one thing. It was everything. The moss-covered rocks were slippery. The passages were confusing, turning back on themselves. And scattered throughout were holes in the cave floor, some barely visible in the dim light, that dropped straight down for over 100 feet into chambers no one had ever fully explored. If you fell into one of those pits, you weren't coming back. The rescue teams had tried before. It never worked. That was the reputation of the Devil's Kitchen on September 3rd, 2006, when 9 friends from Manjummal, Kerala, decided to visit. They called themselves the Manjummal Boys, a tight-knit group of painters and workers from the Darshana Arts Club near Kochi. They had grown up together, played together, worked together. This Onam vacation was supposed to be their big adventure, a celebration of their friendship. They pooled their money and headed to the hill station of Kodaikanal. Siju David, nicknamed Kutan, was the unofficial leader. At 26, he was older than most of the others. Then there was 19-year-old Subhash Chandran, quiet, artistic, the youngest in the group. That morning, before leaving for the caves, Subhash had grabbed his younger brother's belt from the wall. There had been a brief argument between the siblings over it. Such a small, stupid thing. But everything happens for a reason that dictates our future and our end. The group arrived at the Guna Caves around midday. The place was stunning. Massive boulders creating cathedral-like spaces, shafts of sunlight breaking through the gaps, the whole area shrouded in that famous Kodaikanal mist. They saw the fence. It was broken in places, easy to cross. They saw the warning sign, but it was in Tamil. They were from Kerala. They couldn't read it, so they went in. At first, it was everything they'd hoped for. They explored the chambers, took photos, carved Manjummal Boys 2006 into one of the rock walls. The caves felt like their own private adventure, a story they'd tell for years. While the guys were exploring, they suddenly realized that when they arrived, they were a total of 9 people. Now, they are 8. Subhash had vanished. One moment he was there, the next moment, just gone, without any sound or anything. Abhilash John was the first to notice. He'd been standing next to Subhash, and suddenly there was just empty space. The group rushed over. There, in the cave floor where Subhash had been standing, was a hole, maybe 3 feet, 1 meter across, irregular, the edges hidden by shadows and moss. They shined their phone lights into it. The beams disappeared into blackness. No bottom. No sound of impact. Just nothing. Someone shouted to him to stop fooling around and that the joke's over. But no one laughed. They all knew. Subhash wasn't joking. Some of the friends ran for help while others stayed, calling into the hole, hoping for a response. They ran to the nearby shop, breathless and terrified. The shopkeeper, Arumugam, listened to their story and all the color drained from his face. "Devil's Kitchen," he said quietly. "Nobody comes back from there. 13 people have fallen in." He didn't finish the sentence but made a gesture that said their friend was now one of them. However, he agreed to show them back to the spot. Meanwhile, other friends were at the police station, trying to explain what happened. The police inspector's first reaction wasn't sympathy. It was suspicion. He thought they'd murdered their friend and were staging an accident. But then it was evident that this wasn't the case. By the time authorities arrived at the caves, hours had passed. Rain had started falling, cold and heavy. The police, fire department, and forest officials stood around the hole, shaking their heads. A fire service officer lowered a rope and called down into the darkness. It was more procedure than hoped. Everyone there knew the reputation of this place. Then they heard it, faint, weak, barely human, but unmistakable. a cry from deep below. Subhash was alive. Previously, he had stepped forward, unaware that the rock beneath him was slick with moisture and loose soil. His foot pressed down, and in an instant, the ground gave way. There was no time to shout, no moment to react. The earth crumbled soundlessly, and his body slipped through the narrow gap, vanishing into darkness. He fell silently, arms scraping against the jagged walls, trying to grab something, anything, to stop the fall. But the shaft was too tight, the rock too smooth. But then, with a violent jolt, his belt, the same belt for which he had an argument with his brother, caught on a protruding edge. The force twisted him sideways, slamming his shoulder and head against the wall. Pain exploded through him, but it also stopped the fall and saved his life during that time. Now, probably wedged deep inside the crevice, motionless and breathless, he could barely move. After he was located, the officials estimated, based on how faint his voice sounded, that he'd fallen at least 120 feet, 36.5 meters down. That's a 12-story building, a fall that should have killed him instantly. Somehow, impossibly, he'd survived just because of that belt. However, he was still stuck deep inside and was on borrowed time. But the officer in charge pulled David aside and told him something that made his blood run cold. 10 years ago, a central minister's nephew fell into this same hole. They brought in special forces, expert rescue teams, every resource the government could provide, but they still couldn't save him and never even found his body. The message was clear. Subhash might be alive now, but he wouldn't be for long, and anyone who tried to go down after him would just add another body to the count. The firemen tried everything they could from the surface. They lowered a longer rope, calling for Subhash to tie it around himself. No response. He'd lost consciousness. They discussed pumping oxygen down. They discussed calling for specialized equipment from other cities. But everyone there knew the truth. By the time any of that arrived, Subhash would be dead. David stood there watching these professional rescuers. These men trained to save lives, and not one of them was willing to go down. They were terrified, and they had every right to be. But David wanted to save his friend, so he decided that he'd go in. The police immediately protested. They told him he's not trained. The oxygen levels down there would kill him. But David was determined. He wasn't going back on his words. What happened next would be described as either the bravest or the most foolish thing anyone at the Guna Caves had ever witnessed. David tied a 50-foot, 15-meter rope around his waist. He grabbed a small flashlight, and at roughly 4 p.m., 3 hours after Subhash had fallen, he lowered himself into the Devil's Kitchen. The descent was immediately nightmarish. The hole was barely wide enough for his shoulders. The walls were slick with moisture and covered in moss and bat droppings. It was cold. The smell was overwhelming. Decay and ammonia and something ancient. His flashlight revealed glimpses of the vertical shaft, jagged rocks, places where the passage narrowed to almost nothing, then opened into larger chambers. At around 60 feet, 18 meters down, David turned off his flashlight. The bats. There were hundreds of them, disturbed by his presence, their wings beating chaos in the confined space. The sound was disorienting, terrifying. He kept descending in pitch darkness, one hand on the rope, one hand touching the slimy walls. The first rope ran out. David was dangling in absolute blackness, still nowhere near the bottom. His friends above shouted down, asking if he was okay. The police told him to come back up. It was too dangerous to continue. But David could hear Subhash, so he was not planning to give up. There was a long pause. Then they tied another rope to the first one and kept lowering him into the darkness. At approximately 120 feet, 36.5 meters down, deeper than any rescue attempt had ever gone in the Guna Caves, David's flashlight finally found Subhash. He was lying on a narrow rock ledge, maybe 3 feet, 1 meter wide, jutting out from the shaft wall. His body was twisted, blood covered his face and clothes. He was lying in a pool of black water, but his chest was moving. He was breathing. David carefully maneuvered onto the ledge. The space was barely big enough for one person. One wrong move, and they'd both plummet into the deeper darkness below. Subhash's eyes snapped open, wild, terrified, not recognizing anything. In his traumatized state, he saw only a figure in the darkness. In the darkness below, David managed to calm Subhash enough to make him understand. He tied the rope around Subhash's torso and signaled to the surface that they were ready. The ascent took another hour. Every foot was agony. The rope scraped against rocks. Both men bumped against the walls, reopening wounds. Subhash kept passing out, but then came back to consciousness. At one point, the rope snagged on an outcropping, and they were stuck. They thought, this is it, and now it's going to be impossible to get out. However, hanging in darkness, David worked to free it, and then the ascent continued. But inch by inch, they rose from the Devil's Kitchen. When they finally emerged, nearly 6 hours after Subhash had fallen, a cheer went up from the crowd that had gathered. Subhash was rushed to the hospital, unconscious but alive. David collapsed, his hands shredded, his body shaking. What none of them knew was that they'd just achieved the impossible. Subhash Chandran had become the first and only person in history to fall into the depths of the Guna caves and come out alive. What happened? After, well, the Manjumal boys were charged with trespassing in a prohibited area and fined 2,500 rupees. More painfully, they agreed among themselves not to tell anyone the full story. When people asked about Subhash's injuries, they said he'd fallen from a waterfall. They thought they were protecting him, protecting his family. Subhash spent 60 days recovering, but the physical wounds healed faster than the psychological ones. He suffered nightmares so severe he needed trauma therapy for 6 months. And his mother blamed David. She didn't know he'd saved her son's life. She only knew Subhash had gone on a trip with David and come back broken. But eventually, the truth came out. When Subhash's mother learned what really happened, she broke down crying, apologizing to David. In 2008, Siju David received the Jeevan Raksha Padak, India's civilian award for bravery from the president at the time. On the morning of Sunday, March 27, 1977, 4 young men stood at the entrance to Indian Creek Caverns in Stone County, Missouri, about 40 miles, 64 kilometers south of Springfield. Doug Beckerdite and Gary Blades, both 20 years old. Ed Brown, also 20. And Wayne Smith, the youngest at 18. They had flashlights, 1 electric headlamp, and the kind of confidence that comes from not knowing what you don't know. Before entering, they did something responsible. They left a note on their pickup truck with Ed Brown's father's phone number, just in case. Then they walked the half-mile from the road to the cave entrance and disappeared into the darkness. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that while they were gearing up for their Sunday adventure, something was happening in the sky above them. Rain had started falling, not a gentle spring shower, but a torrential downpour that would continue for hours, dumping water onto the Missouri landscape like someone had torn open the clouds themselves. Indian Creek Caverns wasn't some tourist attraction with paved walkways and electric lights. Locals sometimes called it Old Mud Cave, and if you knew anything about Missouri caves, you knew what that meant. This was a wild cave system, the kind where you squeeze through tight passages and crawl through mud and feel the mountain pressing down on you from all sides. The kind of place that floods when it rains. Really floods. But the 4 young men didn't know that. They were inexperienced. This might have even been their first time underground. So, when they entered that Sunday morning, they had no idea they were walking into a trap that was already being set. The cave system had 2 main levels. There were the dry upper passages, higher elevation, mostly safe from water. And then there was the stream level, the lower passages where an underground creek flowed through the limestone. The 4 friends made their way through the entrance. The temperature inside was probably around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius. Cold enough to notice, but not unbearable. Not yet. They explored the passages, moving deeper into the cave. The rain outside kept falling, and falling, and falling. By Sunday evening, when they should have been emerging from the cave, heading back to their truck, maybe grabbing dinner somewhere and laughing about their underground adventure, they weren't at the entrance. They were somewhere deep in the cave system, and something had gone terribly wrong. When they failed to return Sunday night, Ed Brown's father made the call. The Stone County Sheriff's Office responded, and deputies began searching the area around the cave. The truck was still there. The note was still there. And the cave entrance, when they shined their lights into it, looked different than it should have. Water. More water than anyone expected. The cave was flooding. By Monday afternoon, with the 4 young men now more than 24 hours overdue, the sheriff's office called in Dave Neff, an experienced cave explorer and former advisor to the School of the Ozarks Troglodytes, the local caving club. Neff took one look at the situation and knew they needed a proper rescue operation. He organized a team that included other experienced rescuers and an emergency medical technician. By the time they assembled at the cave entrance at 5 p.m. Monday, the rain had finally stopped, but the damage was done. 7 inches, 18 centimeters of rain had fallen. 7 inches that was now draining into every crack and crevice in the landscape, all of it flowing underground, all of it pouring into Indian Creek caverns. The rescue team split into 2 groups. The first would search the dry upper levels. The best case scenario was that the 4 had retreated to higher ground and were just waiting out the flood. The second team would wait for wetsuits to arrive before attempting to search the flooded stream level. At 8 a.m. Tuesday morning, now more than 36 hours after the 4 had entered, the first rescue party went in. The water level inside the cave was catastrophic, 5 feet, 1.5 meters above normal. Old-timers who'd been exploring these caves for decades couldn't remember the last time Indian Creek had flooded this badly. The rescuers pushed forward through passages that were supposed to be dry, finding themselves wading through chest-deep water with only 6 inches, 15 centimeters, of airspace between the surface and the ceiling. They had to tilt their heads back just to breathe. Then the passage got deeper, and they had to swim, their lights barely penetrating the muddy water. 3 of the rescuers turned back. 3 continued, pushing deeper into the flooded cave. Then at 9 a.m., only 390 feet, 119 meters from the entrance, not even a tenth of a mile underground, they found them. The 4 young men were lying together in about 2.5 feet, 76 centimeters of water, not floating, lying. And they weren't scattered or separated. They were arranged in a line. The rescuer who found them would later describe the scene in an affidavit, and what he described was so strange, so impossibly ordered, that it would haunt everyone who heard about it. The 4 were positioned one behind the other, facing back into the cave, back toward the deeper passages, away from the entrance. The man at the rear of the line had his hands clutched tight on the sides of the 3rd man at chest level. The 3rd man had his hands clutched identically on the 2nd. The 2nd man was holding the 1st man the same way. A human chain, locked together even in death. The lead man, the one at the front of this desperate line, wasn't holding on to anyone. In one hand, he clutched a pair of glasses by their bridge, the earpieces unfolded and sticking straight ahead, like he'd been holding them out in front of him, maybe trying to see better, maybe offering them to someone. In his other hand was a flashlight, and around his neck, resting on his chest, was the electric headlamp, still glowing. After more than 36 hours underground, the light was still burning. The rescuers stared at this scene, trying to understand what they were looking at, trying to piece together what had happened in this cave, in the darkness and the rising water. In those final hours, here's what Dave Neff and the other experienced spelunkers believe happened, piecing together the evidence from that terrible scene. The 4 friends had entered the cave Sunday morning, when everything was fine. They'd explored for hours, probably having a great time, going deeper into the system, checking out passages, getting muddy, getting that unique thrill that comes from being underground in a place few people ever see. But while they were deep in the cave, the water was rising. The rain that had started Saturday night was draining into the system, and the underground stream was swelling, filling passages that were normally high and dry. By Sunday evening, when the 4 tried to leave, they reached the entrance area and found it blocked. Water. Deep, cold water where there should have been a walkable passage. They were trapped. So they did the smart thing. They retreated to the dry upper levels to wait it out. They knew the rain would stop eventually. The water would recede. They just had to wait. They were cold from wading through the water, but they had lights. They had each other. They would be okay. Hours passed. Sunday night, Monday morning. They were getting colder. The cave was 55 degrees, 13 degrees Celsius, and they were wet. Hypothermia was setting in, that insidious condition where your body temperature drops degree by degree, where you start shivering uncontrollably, where your thinking gets fuzzy and your movements get clumsy. At some point Monday morning, they decided to try again. Maybe the water had dropped. Maybe they could make it. They had to try. The lead man, whoever he was since it wasn't specified in the reports, put in a fresh battery for the headlamp. This detail is crucial. A 6-volt lantern battery wouldn't burn for more than 10 hours. If the headlamp was still glowing when they were found Tuesday morning, that meant a fresh battery had been installed sometime Monday. They were preparing for another attempt to get out, but by this point, they were in bad shape. Hours of being cold and wet had taken their toll, so they made a decision. They would stay together. The person in front would lead, and the others would hold on, following in a chain so no one got separated in the dark, flooded passages. Can you imagine that moment? The conversation they must have had. The decision to try one more time, knowing how weak they'd become, knowing the water might still be too high, but also knowing they couldn't just stay in the upper passages forever, getting colder and weaker by the hour. They started moving. The lead man went first, holding his glasses in one hand. Behind him, the second man held on to him at chest level. Behind the second, the third, behind the third, the fourth. A human chain shuffling through the flooded passages, each person holding tight to the one in front, because letting go meant getting lost, meant drowning alone in the dark. They made it to the entrance area, and the water was still there, still too deep, still impassable. They had to go back. They turned around, still holding on to each other, and started back toward the upper levels, back into the cave. But something happened. The lead man finally collapsed. Hypothermia or fatigue finally overwhelmed his body's ability to function. When he fell, the others fell too, because he was the one pulling them forward. He was the force keeping them going, and when that force disappeared, there was nothing left. They went down in the water, still holding on to each other, 2.5 feet, 76 centimeters, deep. Not even waist deep, but when you're suffering from severe hypothermia, when your body is shutting down, when you've been fighting for your life for over 24 hours in the cold and the dark, 2.5 feet of water might as well be an ocean. Their last breaths, their lungs filling with water, their hands still gripping the person in front of them, still holding on. Because even at the very end, even as everything was going dark, they refused to let go of each other. And then, nothing. Just 4 young men lying in a line in the darkness, the headlamp still glowing on the lead man's chest, illuminating nothing but muddy water and stone. When the bodies were removed from the cave by 11:30 a.m. Tuesday, the county coroner determined the cause of death was drowning. There was water in their lungs. But the experienced cave explorers knew it was more complicated than that. Yes, they'd drowned, technically, but hypothermia had killed them first, shutting down their bodies until they couldn't keep their heads above water anymore. The strange, ordered way they were found, still in a line, still holding each other, suggested they'd all died at almost the same moment, which should have been impossible, but somehow wasn't. This was one of the most haunting cave rescue scenes in Missouri history. Not because they'd been reckless or stupid, but because they'd done everything they could to survive, and it simply wasn't enough.